Good morning, everyone. I think Fee's presentation couldn't have set me up any better for what I want to share with you. And it's so good to see from the three words that you've all shared from that breakout just what you're looking to achieve in terms of the culture in your organisation. But I want you to just have a look at those three words for a moment and just think back to when you first came into the workplace and when you first moved into a leadership position, and ask yourself, would you have been expected to write the same three words then? If, like me, you're Generation X or a boomer, the chances are you grew up where leadership was seen in a very different way, where leaders were seen as infallible, placed on pedestals, expected to know all of the answers and held up as a beacon for everyone. Leaders didn't get anything wrong. Leaders didn't have any issues or challenges. They were the tower of strength to all of us. And I think that a lot of that image was based on three things. Leaders were expected to be strong and to be seen to be strong. Leaders were expected to be resilient and to be seen to be resilient. Leaders were expected to take the lead and be seen to take the lead. But the three words that you each posted from your conversations in the breakout suggest that maybe that model is breaking down, maybe that it's changing. And what I've seen there isn't a surprise to me. And I'm sure it wasn't a surprise to many of you, because we're all aware of this change in the air that's been happening over maybe the last decade, probably since Brené Brown's TED Talk and first book really brought the issue of vulnerability onto a much more public open, into a much more public open discussion. And there are plenty of conversations about vulnerability, including this one. There are plenty of books about vulnerability, including mine, which you each have. And we're seeing it all of the time. I read in the Times this morning, Monzo, the online bank, have just said that all of their long-term staff, and I found it quite funny, for them a long-term serving member of staff is 4 years, but anyone who's served 4 years or more can now take a 3-month career break fully paid. And the comment was that they can come back fresher, they can come back clearer and able to deal with their customers better. And they talked about it in terms of the mental health of their staff, something that wouldn't have happened years ago. And what really struck me about that article this morning was that it talked about the CEO of Monzo had led this culture because he's been very open about his own mental health issues. And that's something else we've been seeing. Senior leaders coming out and saying, I'm not perfect and I've had these struggles and this is what I've learned from it. And I've interviewed many of those people. I know a number of those people and I know the impact they have on their staff. I know the impact that it had on the team at one of my clients, at one of the big accountancy firms in the UK, to see their CEO delivering their town halls from his spare bedroom and just seeing behind the curtain, particularly during the pandemic. So we have seen big changes, but are we exactly where we need to be? And are we as far along as we really give ourselves credit for? Not everyone thinks we are. If you look back last year when various lockdowns ended in the United States, you had the leaders of some of the big banks, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, turn around and simply say, you're going to come into the office. One of them turned around and said, if you want to earn New York money, you work in New York. They weren't brooking any discussion. They weren't allowing for empathy. They weren't allowing for people's different needs and how it might impact them working remotely. It was their way or the highway, which is more the classic model. And last week, I interviewed Pat Nevin for my podcast. Now, if you're a football fan, and I know I'm speaking to an audience in Wales, and football is probably the wrong sport to choose as an example, But if you're a football fan, you may remember Pat Nevin. Pat Nevin was a great winger for Chelsea and Everton, among others. Played for Scotland many times, made over 850 career appearances, went on to be chairman of the Professional Footballers Association, CEO of a football club, Premier League football club in Scotland, Motherwell, and is now a very respected broadcaster. And when I talked about this, because it just came up in our first conversation, and I talked about this changing culture, Pat just shook his head. He said, no, it's the opposite. He said, we're going completely the other way. He said companies like Facebook and Google, he really honed in on those Silicon Valley giants. He said they don't treat their people with respect. They treat people like algorithms. And he said to me, large conglomerates don't see human beings. They don't work with individuals anymore. The reason why, it's not good for the bottom line. So we are on a journey. And on balance, I think we are moving forward in that journey, but maybe not as quickly as we might think. But things are changing, and vulnerability is something that people are much more open to. And when looking at the culture within an organization, it's much more expected now than before that leaders will be open. Just not everyone's making that journey as quickly as the rest of us, perhaps. But if we are making that journey, what does that mean for that classic model? What does that mean in terms of how you can be a leader and be seen to be strong? What does it mean in terms of how you can be a vulnerable leader and be seen to be resilient? And what does it mean in terms of how you can be seen to be a vulnerable leader and still be seen to lead? My contention that I want to argue this morning is that you can be all of those things and be a vulnerable leader. And in fact, I believe that vulnerability, far from being the opposite of those qualities, is an ingredient of those qualities and leads you to be stronger, more resilient, and a better leader. And that's what I want to focus on this morning. So let's start by looking at being a strong leader and how vulnerability plays into that. Avril Price is a director, a corporate director at Wealdon District Council in Sussex. And a couple of years ago, Avril was working away from home and she suffered a brain hemorrhage. And she found herself in the middle of the night on her own, phoning the paramedics and being carted off to hospital. She was texting people, she was messaging people on LinkedIn, telling them that she couldn't attend the meeting in the morning, but she doesn't remember any of that. She doesn't remember anything from being taken to that hospital to waking up in critical care unit 2 days later. The hospital contacted her partner and suggested to her partner that she reach out to Avril's family and tell them they needed to come down. It was that drastic. Avril did make a recovery. She's back in her role, but that took time. When she left hospital, she couldn't walk to the end of her street. It took her 4 months to get back to work. And then when she got back to work, she pushed herself too hard. In fact, it took her a year to get back to normal, back to the level that she expected. And Avril said to me that whole experience just changed her whole perception, her whole perspective, her whole view on how she worked. And I asked her how. She said, I don't push myself as hard anymore. Deadlines are less imperative now. I put them into context. And she said, I'm more compassionate as well with my team. I see the whole person. And Avril's really lived by that. Yes, she did rush when she got back, but then she learned to slow down. And she's open about it, really transparent. So she will have afternoon naps and she will tell her team that that's what she's doing. She leads the wellness session in her team meetings and she gets really emotional during that wellness session, and she blogs on the council's intranet site about her experience and about her journey. And the reason I share this is for two reasons. We talk about leaders being strong. That starts with you. You can't be strong for other people if you're not strong within yourself. So you have to start by looking after number one. And your well-being is a key priority. And that became really clear to Avril on that journey. And the second reason that I share Avril's story is the impact it's had on other people. Her openness, her transparency, her willingness to bear all, to talk about having afternoon naps, for example, has allowed other people to feel that they can do the same. So Avril said to me, when you explain what's happening to you, people understand. The worst thing for me would have been not to have been brave enough to be honest. And that helped everyone else. People want to see you as human. You're not on a pedestal any longer. And this goes back to that point I made at the beginning, how traditionally we put leaders on a pedestal. And it's a point I'll come back to again and again, because I think that's a key point where the model changes. Think about that infallibility that I talked about that leaders need to express in the traditional model. That doesn't work. People don't engage with infallibility, certainly not anymore. People want to see your fallibility. In Just Ask, I quote a Harvard Business School study where they wanted to explore the impact of sharing failure and mistakes and challenges on the way people perceive success. So they ran a number of studies and they measured the response of the audience, if you like, in two forms of envy, what they called malicious envy and benign envy. Malicious envy is where people think, I want you to fail. Don't care what you've done, I want you to fail. Benign envy, I want to be like you. And the final experiment was a Dragon's Den style pitching competition. And two different types of pitches were offered. Pitch number one was, this business is brilliant, we've made a great success of it, and everything is wonderful. And everything in that pitch was positive. Pitch number two, the same outcome, the same positioning, but here are the mistakes we made along the way. Here are the challenges we faced en route. And they found that in the first example, where everything was purely positive, levels of malicious envy were high. But in the same example, in terms of the same outcome, but where mistakes were made along the way and shared, benign envy was high. If we share our failures, our mistakes along the way, we take ourselves off the pedestal, we make ourselves more human, and people feel they can learn from us, they can engage with us, they are more like us. And to me, that wasn't a surprise at all. As a professional speaker, I know the power of not putting myself on a pedestal, even if I'm on the stage. I remember very early in my career, there's one particular talk that really stands out for me. And it wasn't a special talk. It wasn't a major talk. It was a relatively small audience, maybe 20 or 30 people. Small businesses, micro businesses in a local branch of Barclays Bank in Whitechapel in East London. And I gave a talk that I had given countless times before. But there was something different that evening. The response was off the charts. It was so different to normal. Now, I'm not saying my talks were terrible before that, all of the others, but this was on a different level. The buzz in the room after I finished. I'll measure a talk in person by initially by how people respond to me straight after the talk. So if I come back into the audience after speaking and no one wants to talk to me, I'm not getting a good feeling about that talk. But if everyone is queuing to talk to me, then it feels good. And that's what that evening was like. Everyone was buzzing around me. And I looked back afterwards and I thought, what made that talk so different? What made that stand out? And I realized the talk was structured into three parts, much like today's is. And I would always tell a story to illustrate my key point. And with that talk, which I've been doing for a long time, the stories would change depending on what had happened over the last week or 2 or 3 weeks, things that had really stood out for me. So I wouldn't necessarily know what stories I was going to share when I went in to deliver the talk. It was very intuitive, instinctive. That day, that evening, all 3 stories I shared involved mistakes that I'd made and what I'd learned from them. I hadn't planned that. I just realized in hindsight that's what resonated with people. One of them was, at the time I was running business networking groups. It was a business that my father had co-founded with his business partner, and in my late 20s I joined them. And I was made a director within a year or two, and I was going to all of the groups around the country and supporting them and advising them and so forth. And what I didn't realize was I was going into rooms full of people who were more experienced than me, who had started their own business. I hadn't. I'd joined my dad's business, and I was telling them what to do. One particular example was our Mayfair group, which was chaired by a senior partner in a very prestigious firm, a London law firm. And I was walking into this partner in a big law firm as someone in his early 30s, cocksure, never really achieved anything in his career at that point, and I was telling him what to do. No humility. And it was rubbing people up the wrong way, and I had no idea. And it was only when my dad shared that with me that I was able to change how I was with people. And I shared that story in that talk. That was just one example of it. I mean, if I had had the humility that my dad was trying to draw out, I wouldn't have had the story to share in that talk. But it resonated with people. When you're standing on stage and saying I was arrogant and I was upsetting people, it makes a difference. It makes an impact. So as leaders, we need to start looking at number one. But then if we focus the whole time on appearing strong to everyone else, we're creating a barrier that doesn't allow us to really lead them. And that can have a massive impact on our ability to really engage people and take them where we want to go. So we need to start with number one. And that's probably the hardest thing to do. This is the first time I've ever delivered this presentation. It's a brand new presentation designed for you guys. But as part of the journey to create it, late last year, I delivered a facilitated discussion on this topic. I just wanted to explore what I felt would fit into this topic and just see if it would resonate with people at a senior level. So I partner with an organization called the Chairman's Network, and I ran a facilitated discussion with them. And a couple of weeks later, one of the members who was present, who's a very experienced facilitator at CEO level, said to me that the one thing she picked up in the general discussion and in the breakout discussions was that people weren't opening up, even when given permission, even when they were sharing with people who didn't have a direct impact on their career success, they were still closing down because we struggle with opening up to people. So before we go any further, I've made assumptions about the group. I want to find out now where you guys are. So I'm going to ask you to, over the course of this session, just answer a few polls on a site called Mentimeter. So if you have got your mobile phone handy, or a tablet handy, I'm just going to pop up onto the screen now a QR code. And I think the Academy Wales team will also pop the website and URL in the chat for us. But you can see it on the screen there. It's menti.com. menti.com, and the code 28554532. Thanks, Andrew. Andrew's posted it in the chat for you as well. So if you could just capture that QR code, that will take you straight to it, or go to a browser and pop it in there with that code. You will get a question up on screen. The question says, what are you struggling with but not opening up about? This is a completely anonymous poll. We have no idea of knowing who is saying what. So can you just share, as someone has already started doing, just start sharing, what is it you're struggling with but not opening up about? So fear of failure has come up, which I'm sure is a very common one for many people. How to get people to follow me? Now, that could mean on social media, it could mean among your team. But yes, trying to get people to really engage with what you're saying. Workload and energy, I'm sure a very common one. Feeling like I'm not capable of meeting the expectations people have of me. Career direction, taking the next step. Family life, balancing pressures at home and work. Fear of failure again. Struggling with motivation and interest in work. Loss of a baby, which was extremely traumatic. I know about that. Not this particular case, but there's a story similar to that in Just Ask, and I send my condolences to you. A horrific situation. Work-life balance for fear of being looked over for promotional processes. I have time for others, but no time for me. Big one to work on. Making space, work-life balance, workload, boundaries, whether I'm coping, family issues, balancing work and life, work-life balance again, exhaustion. Start to see a lot of threads here as well, don't we? And there's just a couple of points I want to make on this. Number one, do you see how many of these challenges have been repeated in that poll? How many people are struggling with the same thing? When I deliver my Just Ask presentation, the one around the original book, when I deliver it in person, if I can remember that far back, I have an exercise where I share 3 common challenges. So if you were the audience looking at this, I might talk about fear of failure, work-life balance, and managing your energy and exhaustion. And on every seat, there are 2 cards. There's a red card and a green card. And I ask the audience to hold up the red card if they're struggling with that at the moment, and the green card if they struggled with it in the past and have overcome it. And hold up both cards if they've struggled with it in the past, overcome it, and now they're back there again. And you end up with a sea of red and green for every challenge. Looking through your responses there, and I'll make all of these available to you afterwards, can you see just how the problems you're struggling with are not unique to you? And you are in a community here where you're surrounded by people who get it, who have the same challenges and have to work through those as well. Can you also see the damage in bottling that up? We're talking about looking after yourself. What damage is that doing to you when you're carrying that around with you all the time? So when we're talking about understanding where you're at, about being strong, about looking after number one, we need to have an outlet for these challenges, for these issues. The second question for you, also on your Menti, what have you shared within your organization? And actually, I'm going to extend that. What have you shared within your organization or across your network? And what was the outcome of that for you? So we've talked about what you might be bottling up. Now, what have you opened up about, and how did that work out? Phil, I don't know why that code's not recognized, because others are able to do it. If you've got a camera on your phone, let me know in the chat and I'll put the QR code back on screen and you might be able to get through that way. And thank you, Fionn, for your comment. I appreciate that. So we've got a diagnosis of adult ADHD later in life, wonderful acceptance from my team, total blank from superiors. I wonder if those superiors are very much of the old model rather than the new, sadly. I shared that I was feeling overwhelmed and a lot of colleagues stepped forward to support me. Open up about stress and so much pressure, told it was the job. Well-being in the workplace, outcome station-based well-being areas. My concerns and wish to help, ignored. Own mental health when somebody else was struggling. They broke down and appreciated me reaching out. So that, just want to pick up on that one. You shared your own mental health struggles when someone else was struggling. Can you just hold on to that? Remember that when we talk about leading from the front later on. My mental exhaustion, understanding and support, recent bereavements and how it impacted me, outcome greater acceptance, and others in the team sharing. Again, I will share all of these responses with you later. We've got a real mix there. We've got a mix of people who experienced great acceptance, which would have lifted the burden, and others where it was ignored. You need a safe space to share this stuff. I can't come on here and just tell you you need to share without giving you the environment in which to do so. And talking about the environment in which to do so, it would be irresponsible of me to come on here and say, now go out and share with everyone. Go and be totally open, totally transparent. Please don't go back to your organizations and share with your whole team every doubt you've got, every question you don't know the answer to. You will become the absolute opposite of that traditional leader. And that's not what we're trying to achieve here. We still want you to be respected. We still want you to be seen as a leader and instill confidence in people. There are times when you do need to share with your team. I'm a great believer that leaders don't necessarily have the answers, but they collate all of the relevant information and make the key decisions, the ultimate decision. And that involves saying to your team, how do we go about this to get the best answers? But it's not about sharing everything with everybody. What you need is a group of people who you trust. People you can confide in. And for those of you that experienced a negative response in your workplace, I urge you not to be put back downcast by that or put off sharing, but find people that you can trust. You're looking for people whose objectivity you trust, and that may mean taking it out of the workplace. And again, a community like this can create that environment for you. People whose judgment you trust, and that very much often takes it to peer level, and people whose discretion you trust as well. And if you have that objectivity, that judgment, and that discretion all in place, you've got a safe space to share. And then you do it through mentoring. I'm sure many of you mentor other people. I hope you do. I wonder how many of you have a mentor for yourself as well. What I often see when I speak on mentoring is that as people become more experienced, they stop being mentored and start mentoring. There's no reason why they should be mutually exclusive. If you know the value of mentoring, then give to others, but ask for yourself as well. If you don't have a mentor, find one. But there's also mastermind groups. I'm assuming most of you haven't come across the phrase. You may have come across action learning sets, but mastermind groups in short is peer group mentoring. It's a group of peers who get together and support each other. For the same chairman's network that I mentioned earlier, last week I launched a pilot mastermind session where we created a safe space for people to share. In small groups, in each group, one person would take the hot seat and share a challenge, and I provided a structure for them to follow to explore that challenge and come up with solutions and suggestions. And the response has been overwhelmingly positive. This is the same group that wouldn't open up late last year. One of them came back and said that's the best Chairman's Network session she's been to, and she's posted a long blog on LinkedIn about what she learned from it as one example. It's incredibly powerful, but we don't tend to do it. So in summary on that first point, traditionally, we see leaders as strong, and we see vulnerability as the opposite of that. In fact, it doesn't work like that. Vulnerability is strength. It takes courage to open up and say, I don't know, or I'm struggling with this. And by getting the help that you need, you become stronger. So as a leader, start with number one. Recognize where you're struggling, ask for help, and don't be worried to share that vulnerability because it will enhance your message. Next, we move on to something quite closely related to that, and that's resilience. Resilience, the ability to withstand everything that's thrown at us. And again, it's something that's often seen as the opposite of vulnerability. Resilience can be seen as invulnerability. I don't believe that's the case. I think that vulnerability helps you become more resilient. I want to tell you about Col Mahay. So Col is a former Deputy Chief Superintendent and temporary Chief Superintendent of Derbyshire Constabulary. And I asked Col about this. I had a long conversation with him. And I could tell you his story, but actually, I don't think I can do it the same justice he does in his own words. So if it's okay, I'm just going to read to you what he sent to me about his experience. Cole said to me, in 2011, between the 6th and 11th of August, there were a spate of riots that erupted across the UK, starting in London. Copycat riots raced across the UK within a matter of days, with the police service being the target of much of the anger. On the first morning of the riots, I was the duty gold commander responsible for overseeing any major incident across Derbyshire. It was clear that we needed to muster resources and bring together a plan to deal with any disorder across the county. The chief constable had already given a diktat that we would not be having any riots in Derbyshire. The pressure was on. Already neighbouring forces like Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire were seeing police stations, vehicles and officers being attacked. I was asked to lead on this as the lead public order commander and oversee the policing response. This was a huge undertaking. I had to ensure that we had enough qualified, significant resources, briefed and stationed at key locations throughout the county so that we could respond at the first suggestion of a gathering. I also had to deploy the right resources to key communities to facilitate communication between the police and communities and to prevent disorder. For the next 5 days, I felt the pressure of being the leader shouldering the burden. In an environment where strength was to show confidence and remain cool, calm and collected, I felt that I couldn't show any vulnerability to any of my peers. I ended up working 16-hour days, pushing myself and my teams to their limits. It wasn't until I was exhausted by day 4 that I finally shared my thoughts with a friend. The relief of being able to talk about my vulnerabilities was just incredible. My friend was able to help my tired brain by testing my thinking and helping to critique my tactics. We pulled together to continue to develop the strategy and to deploy our resources. In Derbyshire, we experienced no major disturbances or damage to property. No officers had been injured, and our community confidence rates actually increased. I learned that resilience isn't about being strong in the natural way of thinking, in the natural way of thinking in the police service, but despite having fear and doubt, having the courage and strength to share vulnerability. That age-old adage of a problem shared is a problem halved was relevant and true. The beauty of any team where vulnerability is the norm of that is that trust is established. The foundation of trust leads to improved performance. That was my experience on that occasion and on many subsequent ones. You can't really think of many situations that could surpass taking responsibility for ensuring that your county stays riot-free in the midst of national riots to demonstrate the need for resilience and the impact that that can have on you as you get worn down over those 5 days of 16-hour days and no sleep and taking all of that onto your shoulders. What Cole demonstrated there was the power of turning to someone else to help him withstand those challenges. To me, that's why vulnerability is such a key ingredient in terms of resilience. I just want you to go back to the poll again, please, and you'll see the next question come up on screen. What does resilience mean to you? Can you just share some of your thoughts on what resilience means and how you would define it? Surviving, focused, adaptive, open, prepared, tenacity, bouncing back, durability, intentional, tenacity, confidence, bounce back ability. It's funny how that's entered the lexicon now, isn't it? Flexibility, buffer, focus, calm, strength, support, learning, keep going through adversity, intentional, I think we've said, resolute, relaxed. We've got a lot of words there, but I think what a lot of them have in common is they all become easier with the help of other people. Just give me a thumbs up or a nod if you think that makes sense. That it's a lot easier to have the strength you need to survive. It's a lot easier to adapt. It's a lot easier to find that inner strength. It's a lot easier to learn and to move forward, to persevere, to juggle, all of those things mentioned, if other people support you on that journey. And yet, resilience is often seen as the opposite of vulnerability. Resilience is being invulnerable to whatever life throws at you. But none of us are that rock. We all have our breaking point. And the challenge in life is to find out what we can do to push that breaking point further and further away from us. And where you see people most often have breakdowns is because they're not opening up and they don't have the support they need. They don't have the solution to their challenges within themselves. And they see that as a negative. We're going back to being seen as strong. So they can't search and find the solution elsewhere. And if you can't search and find the solution elsewhere, it's harder to be resilient. So I want to move away from this traditional perspective of the best leaders are rocks. The best leaders soak up whatever comes their way and still are standing, and change the narrative. And let's change that narrative to the best leaders can cope with whatever's thrown in their path because they have the people around them who help them navigate through those obstacles and find their way through to the other side. I would add something else that's not in the common definition of resilience, but it's in my understanding of the term. And that is that we're withstanding all of these things with a purpose. And that purpose is to achieve our ultimate objective. That my definition of resilience is that we can achieve whatever we want to achieve despite what is thrown in our way. And when we have the help of other people, it becomes quicker to reach that objective. It becomes easier to reach that objective, and we reach that objective in a more effective and powerful way. That, to me, means resilience. So we've looked so far at changing the mindset, the narrative around the leader as strong, and understand that the support from other people gives you that strength. And being vulnerable allows people to engage with you as well. So actually, this myth that we want our leaders to be infallible is untrue, because actually we want our leaders to be human. And then we can really engage with them and learn from them. And we've looked at changing our narrative, changing our mindset around resilience. And instead of seeing that leader as a rock off whom all things bounce, see that leader as someone who can navigate the path through whatever comes in their way because they ask for help and they get the support they need. And finally, we need to look at that myth, if you like, of the leader is seen to lead. And I'm going to add to that, seen to lead from the front. Rather than being seen to lead from the front, maybe let's think about leading from among our team rather than in front of our team, because then you have people all around you. I talked a couple of times about leaders being put onto pedestals and how we traditionally elevate leaders in our mind's eye. And I think this was one of the comments that came up in one of the earlier polls that I asked you to hang on to, was very much around that point. One area in which we do that is our leaders in public life. And whether you look at leaders we look at our public figures in the world of sports, we put them on pedestals. They manage to knock themselves off pretty well at the moment, but we do put them on the pedestal. People in entertainment and the arts, we think they're superhuman. I was going to say politicians, but I'm not really sure that's very relevant these days. But politicians traditionally, we want to elevate our politicians to be better than the rest of us. But the fact is that everyone is human, with all of the faults and all of the doubts and all of the challenges that we all face. And if we can admit that and open up to that, people believe in us more. They can relate to us more. Hattie Webb is a singer, successful singer. She has a successful solo career with her sister Charlie. They have the Webb Sisters, which is a very successful act. And Charlie and Hattie are also very well known as backing singers at the highest level. They work with Sting. They work with Leonard Cohen. I was lucky enough to see them perform with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers in Hyde Park on their last tour. And I sat down and spoke with Hattie for Just Ask, to share some of her stories in Just Ask. But there were a couple of stories that she shared, just anecdotes that really stood out for me, partly from my personal interest in live music. I'm a huge music fan, and partly I think because it just fits what I'm trying to get across. She talked about those tours with Leonard Cohen, who she was with for 8 years, and with Tom Petty. And she shared a couple of stories. So she was on tour with Leonard Cohen, and they were backstage before a gig in Vancouver. And they were backstage getting a coffee, which I just love about this, because all of these rock and roll stories you don't picture your great stars getting a coffee just before going on stage. It's normally a Jack Daniels or something by the bottle. But anyway, Leonard Cohen was pouring himself a coffee, and Hattie looked over and his hand was shaking quite violently. And he saw Hattie looking at him, and he laughed and he said, yes. He said, even after all of these years. And it was so clear he was nervous, absolutely petrified before going on stage. And with Tom Petty, it was the same thing. They were just before going on stage in Austin, Texas, and they were in a golf buggy going from the artist's area to the stage, obviously an outdoor large-scale concert like the Hyde Park one. And they were in this buggy with Sharon Robinson, who was Tom Petty's songwriting partner, and Hattie and Charlie. And Tom Petty turned around to the three of them, and he just said, I don't think I can do this. Now, this is a man who had the most amazing career in music, one of the best known rock stars of his generation, who performed in front of probably millions of people all around the world. And on his last ever tour, he's turning around and saying, I don't think I can do this. I love those stories because they take those stars, those rock stars, and they take them off of that pedestal and make them human again. And I think in leadership terms, that's so important. What Hattie said to me, if you feel like you're in it with someone else, it feels less daunting. Leaders on a pedestal doesn't work. Lead from among your team, your staff, your people, and they'll engage with you. And I can see Bethan has said in the chat that that the challenge is also the notion that leadership is lonely. From what I'm hearing, it shouldn't be. No, it shouldn't. But of course, it's going to be lonely if you set yourself apart from everyone else. And that's where you do need that environment of peers around you. When I used to run the networking groups, and Beth, and this goes to your point, when I used to run the networking groups, so we ran groups for small businesses all around the UK. And we had all types of small businesses there. And the predominant focus of those meetings was to generate referrals, new business through referral from each other. And in one of our groups in Ruislip in West London, we had a guy who ran the local Alfa Romeo service centre. And he said to me one day, I don't want referrals. I don't need referrals from this group. I get my referrals from Alfa Romeo dealerships, from Alfa Romeo clubs, from Alfa Romeo magazines. I don't need referrals from this group. He said, but I have 17 people working for me, and I can't share with them day in, day out my doubts, my challenges. So I need to be around other business owners in order to get that support. I think there's a balance to be had there. I think that and we're talking about best part of 20 years ago, that conversation, but there could now be a move towards a more open, conversational, transparent approach with his team, which, going back to the 3 words you all shared with Fee before my session, came through very strongly in terms of what you were sharing. But equally, he needed that peer group network that I talked about before when I was talking about the masterminding, for example. So building that community around you. But it's okay to be taken off your pedestal, to step down and to lead from among, not from in front. Probably my role model from my personal network, or from my personal professional network, in terms of this, is a guy called Phil Jones. And Phil is the CEO of Brother UK. You'll all know Brother, the printing manufacturer. And Phil was one of the first people I thought of from a business perspective in writing Just Ask. And if you've done the pre-reading we set, you'll have read what I'm going to share with you. What happened was I sat down with Phil, and it was good for us to have a catch up. We'd known each other for a number of years, but I'd asked him to come along to interview him for the book. And I explained what I was looking to achieve with the book and what I wanted from him. His response wasn't what you might expect, which would be, well, actually, this is how I approach it, and this is the philosophy I have, and this is what I bring into the workplace. This is the culture we've set up. It was none of that. What Phil said, first of all, to me was, you need to speak to Ronnie. And I said, who's Ronnie? He said, Ronnie's one of our warehousemen. And you'll have read Ronnie's story, I think, in the pre-reading. Ronnie's wife had left him, and he'd taken that into work with him. He didn't know how to cope with it, and it was affecting his performance, but he didn't feel comfortable sharing that. And someone picked this up. I think it was Phil's PA, and she arranged for Ronnie to go and talk to Phil, which, Ronnie found quite odd at the time, that his CEO would be in the slightest bit interested in his warehouseman's personal life and troubles. But he said he'd never had a listening to like that. He said Phil was always inquiring, always asking. And Phil recommended some resources, some self-help books that would help Ronnie, and it transformed how he dealt with the situation and made a difference. And I think that there's two things from that story that are so powerful. Number one is that when I gave Phil the opportunity to share his approach, his story as the CEO of the UK arm of a global brand in the book, he immediately passed the baton on to someone who wasn't in that type of role, one of his warehousemen. He left his ego at the door, and he just thought this is the best solution. And I think that parking your ego is so key. And the other is that what Phil did, both in terms of the conversation with me and the way he supported Ronnie, personified exactly why I wanted Phil to talk to me about the book, or for the book. Because he said to me, a key component of our culture is at your side. And if you know Brother, you probably recognize that as their strapline, Brother at your side. And he said that comes to life in being at the side of each other. I realized many years ago that instead of just grinding processes, you need to give people permission to be themselves. You as the leader show the characteristics that demonstrate what it is you're trying to encourage. That's really the whole point I'm trying to make. Creating a culture, creating an environment where people can be human and where people can see you as human. Taking the lead by being the same as everyone else, but showing that you learn from that, and showing that you deal with it and how you deal with it. And that will lift everyone along with you. Creating a culture that allows people to make mistakes and learn from setbacks. Phil shared a story that didn't make the cut for the book purely because of length, about when a key component went missing, and there were only two of them in the world. And it was a key component on a huge contract for a key client. The person who lost that component spoke up straight away, because that's the culture within Brother. They knew they wouldn't be vilified for it and punished for it, but the culture is speak up early so that we can deal with this. And they dealt with it, and they were able to respond because the culture was one where people were allowed to fail. And we have to accept that that is a part of life. Failure sits as part of life. when I interviewed the leadership team from Hong Kong Broadband Network for the book, they said we would never recruit someone who in their interview said they've never failed, because how can they ever have learned anything? I apologized at the beginning of the presentation because I said that my first quote came from the world of football, and speaking to a Welsh audience, maybe that wasn't the best choice. So I thought I'd balance that up with a quote from the world of rugby union. Would that balance things up well and make things better? So I'm not sure that the former coach of England is the best person to go to, the one that won us the World Cup, but forgive me for that. We'll get the balance somewhere in there. But I interviewed Sir Clive Woodward for the book as well. And one of the things he said to me is, my goal is to go from here to here, but I've never had a team that's gone in a straight line. It's always all over the place. You have big wins, big losses, big setbacks, and you've got to handle each in equal measure. We've got to accept that failure is part of the journey, and it's important to build a culture that accepts that failure is a part of that journey. What I'd like you to do, just before we finish, is take 2 minutes and just reflect. I'm not going to ask you to post anything in a poll on this. I'm not going to ask you to share with anyone. You are welcome to post in the chat if you are happy to and you feel it will help, but we're just going to take 2 minutes for reflection. And what I want you to reflect on is when you have failed in your career and how you handled it. Did you bottle it up, and in which case, what was the repercussion? Did you share it, and what did that mean? And with the benefit of hindsight and looking at culture as it is now, if it's changed since that time, how would you handle things now? So I'm just going to turn my camera off for 2 minutes and just let you reflect for 2 minutes. Please feel free to add in the chat, but otherwise just sit on that just for 2 minutes. Okay, so that might be something that you take into the conversations that you're going to have after the break. So what's going to happen is in about 5 minutes, there'll be a half-hour break. At the end of that half-hour break, you'll come back and you'll go straight into facilitated discussions for 45 minutes. I've spoken with all the facilitators last week. We've had a conversation about how to help you dig deeper into this topic and this conversation. And there are different groups with a different area of focus that I've suggested to them, picking different parts out of the conversation and expanding on them, and as well as the further reading. So that will be for about 45 minutes. And then when you come back, we'll have a Q&A session for about 15 minutes. So I'm happy to answer any questions based on this presentation or based on what happens in the facilitated discussion. If there are more questions than the time allows, I will still ask you to pose them, and I'm happy to record a video capturing all of them after the session. So we'll make sure that all of you get your questions answered. So after the break, you'll have the chance to really explore deeper the topics that we've looked at during this presentation. But just to wrap up this part of the conversation, I started out by talking about how the traditional model that many of us grew up with saw leaders put onto pedestals, infallible, all-knowing, never making a mistake, and leading the way from the front. And I talked about how that model was based on the premise that leaders are strong and are seen to be strong. But then I argued that actually vulnerability is a strength. And if you can deal with your own challenges openly and get the support that you need, you will be a stronger leader. And if you open yourselves up and talk about where you haven't got it right, people will be more likely to engage with you, as that Harvard Business School study shows. I talked about how leaders are resilient and seen to be resilient. And I challenged what I believe is the common definition, interpretation of resilience, that we just stand there like a rock and let things bounce off us, and suggested that far from being the opposite of vulnerability, resilience relies upon vulnerability. because the help and the support that you get from other people makes it easier to withstand everything that's thrown in your way and achieve your objective more effectively. And I talked about how traditionally leaders are lead from the front and are seen to lead from the front. But in fact, by using vulnerability, you step down off of your pedestal and you lead from among your team, not from in front of them, engaging them more, creating a culture where failure is I wouldn't use the word acceptable, but something that can be embraced and learnt from. And by creating that culture where you learn from failure, people feel more comfortable opening up, giving you the chance to adapt, the chance to change, the chance to learn as an organization. Share your vulnerability, invite support from other people, equip yourself better by tapping into that network. And ultimately, as a leader, you make the final decision and you take responsibility. But you do that with the help of everyone around you. Uzo, thank you very much. Back over to you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had some really interesting discussions. I've been looking at your jam boards, and there's quite a lot to take away from that, and some looks like some good conversations are being had. So we've got just over 15 minutes left, and that's to open up to you for Q&A. You're welcome to come on camera with a question. Just put your hand up digitally or pop it into the chat. I've had one that came in during the breakouts. I sent a message saying, is it okay to share this? But I didn't get a response, so I'm not going to mention the name. I'm sure it would be fine, but I think it'd be a good place to start. So the comment and the question is fantastic presentation, and I totally subscribe to your approach. That's a nice start. Thank you. I've used it with great success, but my challenge lies in convincing other managers to take the same approach rather than fall back on traditional blame management techniques. That's a very good question. I would look at two areas there to work on, and they're often combined. They're often compared and contrasted to each other, and that's actions and words. And I think that it's a question of both. You lead with your actions. You show the vulnerability. You demonstrate it clearly. You engage people. You take a different approach to failure to the current blame techniques that you say others are showing, and lead by example. But at the same time, you share what you're doing and why. And you share that with the whole organization. You create a conversation about the culture you have within the organization and the culture you want. And I think what that does is two things. Number one is you're modeling the behavior that you want others to follow, and that's key. And you need to do that clearly and transparently, very visibly. And the second is that you're creating a conversation. You're giving people permission to speak up when they see that not being followed, not in a blame way, but actually raising the topic in conversation as well. So those would be that's my initial thought in answer to that question, and I hope that's useful. Do we have any other questions? Pop them in the chat, or just stick your hand up, or just start speaking, because there's no queue at the moment. Hi, Phil.
Thank you, Andy. It's been terrific. I completely support your approach to vulnerability, seeking support, and openness, and the whole person, seeing the person. But I'd like to explore a little with you this question of boundaries, because although we are the person we are at work, and our values are engaged at work, and we spend a large amount of our lives at work, nevertheless, it is also an employment nexus. It is a paid relationship. And we have lives which are outside paid relationships. We have relationships which are not configured in that way, and they're important, and their otherness is important in relation to the workplace. So having been through a personal development program once before at the BBC when I was there, I'm acutely aware of those moments when it feels that we were crossing over into private and personal space, rather than just respecting the human being?
Really, really interesting question, Phil. Thank you. I know that many of you will probably err on the side of a strong divide between the two, between the private and the professional space. As a country, the UK, in my experience, I've spoken in close to 30 countries around the world. In my experience, the UK is pretty much to one side on this, very much erring on the side of, I keep my private life over there and my professional life there, and they're separate. And when you're working for a larger, more hierarchical institution, I started my career in the civil service, I think that becomes even stronger. When I spoke in Milan and I shared how, people like to keep family life and professional life separate, they laughed. And they said, here the family is the business. So some of it is cultural, some of it is personal. There will be people here who would disagree strongly and would say, actually, there aren't any boundaries. Others who would absolutely loathe that thought. So there is a personal element there to consider. You are in control of how much you share with who and how. So I wouldn't prescribe in that case. I would, if you are strongly one way or the other, I would strongly recommend looking at your approach and weighing up the pros and cons, balance it against the approach of someone who takes the opposite to you, and then just say, well, what can I take from that? For me personally, I started out in the civil service. I've run my own business or been involved in our own business for over 20 years now. And the nature of that business means it's built around relationships. So actually, some of my best friends have come through work, and so that line has become very blurred. And I like that. It enriches my life. At the same time, I won't connect on Facebook, for example, with a client unless they invite me. So I tend to go at other people's pace. It's a really rich topic with a lot of opinion. And I don't know if I'm doing it justice in this time, but I think the simplest answer is to say I wouldn't prescribe. I would allow for the line to get blurry, but you can still have the line there. It's a question of where you put that line and how thick you draw it. Does that help, Phil? Because I know there's a lot there.
No, it did help, and it's very wise, and there's a lot of variation. But I'm just concerned in an old Marxist way about the instrumentalizing of relationship, and remembering that a manager is someone with power, and that when power comes into those personal revelations, you have to be very careful. Tread softly, for you tread on my dreams.
Absolutely. And I remember my first management position in that civil service job. I was in my early 20s. I got on very well. I had quite a big team, particularly for my age, but I had a couple of younger, almost girls on the team, teenagers. And I wasn't that far apart from them in age, and I got on really well with them. And that was a problem when it came to appraisals, when my colleagues wanted me to give them bad appraisals, and actually I struggled with that. So that goes back to there is a line. I think there's a difference between opening up and introducing to the conversation the challenges you faced in your personal life to help someone. And I think I saw that come up on one of the jam boards as a response. There's a difference between doing that and becoming their best friend. So you are in control of what you share. I've seen quite a few questions come through now, so we'll go through them. As I said, if I don't manage to answer all of them, I will record a video and cover the rest off. So I'll just ask Andrew or Debbie if you can make sure I've got a record of all the questions at the end. That would be really helpful, but I'll try and screenshot before I go. So Gareth has asked, in order to realise the benefits of this culture, how do you achieve buy-in from the top? I think open conversation. I think clear, open conversation is a starting point, and accept that it's going to be a journey. And if someone is still very much rooted in the old style of leadership that I talked about, you've got to sell the idea, and you need to do that by sharing the benefits and by opening up yourself. I would do that by trying, and again, every every leader is different, so a lot will depend on your relationship with that. I'm assuming your boss, for example, it might be a CEO. It would depend on your relationship with that person, their personality style, and you're going to have to measure. You're going to have to consider all of those points before you get into that conversation. Some of these are a step at a time. Another thing is to see who you can get to support your message and advocate for you. If you presented that to the CEO of your organization, who are they going to then talk to about it? Are they going to be on side? Maybe you should think about who are influencers and see how they feel about it and get them involved in the conversation first. So I would be looking at this not as going with an idea, presenting it and expecting people to go along with it. It's very uncomfortable for people who haven't been on that journey. So I would be looking to build the argument brick by brick and get the advocates, the influencers on side as well to support with that. Again, Gareth, I'm going through these fairly quickly because I've seen quite a lot come in, but I hope that's helpful from that perspective. Any thoughts of the use of reverse mentoring in organizations from Chris? Yes, absolutely. Not just reverse mentoring. I was speaking with someone in the last few days who talked about co-mentoring that they introduce in their organization as well. And I run training programs for mentors and mentees, as well as helping organizations establish that program. Most of the mentoring that is delivered is the traditional senior to junior mentoring relationship. But that conversation we were having, one of the things that we were talking about is how the senior leaders in that organization are being mentored by or co-mentoring relationships with more junior members. And what they're getting from the more junior members is their take on, for example, sustainability. And environmental conversations, because they're closer to the conversation and closer to the debate now. Another classic example for reverse mentoring, which I know of the CEO in a major bank that I work with, is being reverse mentored by quite a junior person on the digital world and engaging digitally with people. So the idea of mentoring is that one person hands the benefit of their experience to someone else, and we assume that is senior to junior, but sometimes it's experience of an area or experience of conversations that the other person isn't privy to. And I think reverse mentoring or co-mentoring is very powerful in that sense. Shana said we do it in our chief is being reverse mentored and is getting a lot out of it. So yeah, absolutely. I think that across Welsh Public Service, there will be examples like this. And if that's of interest, it would be worth having those conversations with each other and say on what topics is that powerful? Because, for me, I knew about the technology, the digital reverse mentoring, but sustainability makes sense as soon as you hear about it, but I hadn't heard about it before. So it's finding out what people are talking about that. Also used in the Welsh Ambulance Service. Also been used as part of the Infuse programme in Cardiff capital region, and participants have found it valuable. So there's a lot there about everyone's using reverse mentoring. So that's really positive. And I think that where that fits in with this presentation in particular is to be reverse mentored, you have to be willing to be vulnerable, and you have to be willing to step off of that pedestal and say to someone in a more junior role, I don't know the answers. And can you help me, and ask for help. And that really does subvert the model I was talking about, which is a really positive thing to my mind. Emma's asked thoughts on how to enable others to open up and adapt when there's not their natural style. Number one, don't push it. You can't force people into that situation. It becomes very uncomfortable. In the book, if you look in the index, because I don't think it's in the required reading area, but if you're not reading the whole book, look up semantic differential questioning. And if you can't find that in the index, look up Ivan Misner, M-I-S-N-E-R. And Ivan talked to me about semantic differential questioning. And the idea of semantic differential questioning is effectively you ask the same question 3 times in different ways, and it opens up the conversation. And since Ivan shared that with me, I found myself using it naturally a lot. So, for example, you might turn around, so I can see Matthew on the screen. I might say, Matthew, how are you? Classic question. Matthew replies in the classic way, I'm fine, thanks. And then I might turn around and say, how are you coping with the pandemic? And Matthew might say, yeah, it's okay, it's fine. It's still relatively closed type question. But the third one, I say, how has it impacted you? And I've opened up the conversation. So I think you can ease people into the conversation with more focused, considered questions. And build through to them. I really like this semantic differential questioning. It works. I found that quite naturally. So Emma, I hope that helps. Fionn, given the emphasis and importance of data going forward, how do you suggest we use or collect data and the evidence to demonstrate the importance and impact of this leadership approach for the organisation? Fionn, I'm going to be vulnerable with you now. I am not a data person. I'm quite an instinct person and a story person. So I'm not going to be, I don't feel in a position, particularly without really having the time to think it through, to share how to collect data on something like this, which has a lot of intangibles involved. What I would share is, in terms of how you use data, I interviewed a Nobel Prize winner for chemistry, Robert Lefkowitz, for my podcast. It's coming out on Monday. And one of the things that I got from Bob's book, and I explored with him on the podcast, is how, as a scientist, he's a physician and researcher, went on to win the Nobel Prize for chemistry, how he uses data to tell stories. So he doesn't educate people through the data, he educates people through what the data tells him, and he turns that into stories. If you wanted to go deeper into that, because it's a fascinating conversation, that will be out on the Connected Leadership podcast on Monday, and that would help with that. But I wouldn't pretend to know how to answer the collection question without a bit longer to think about it. I see there are two. Phil's comment is about reverse mentoring again. And in fact, I think that's all the questions, bang on time. So thank you for those. It was a rattle through, but we got there. I hope that those were helpful. With a name like mine, as long as you can spell it, I am easy to find on social media. So if you have further questions, please feel, I know a lot of you have been using Twitter in the build up to this. I've already had someone reach out on LinkedIn. Please do reach out. Just mention that you're at Academy Wales. If you have any further questions, I am more than happy to engage with you and continue the conversation. I hope that you found this useful. I will be sharing with you those quotes that I used in the presentation today as a reminder for you, the results from the Menti and the Jamboards as well. And I know that in the breakouts, you talked confidentially. You're not, the Jamboards are anonymous. If anyone has any concerns about something they put on a Jamboard being made public, just go in and remove it or edit it, so that you're conscious. If you've got a major issue, because there's a lot on there you think is confidential, if you let your facilitator or the team at Academy Wales know, and let me know what group you're in, and if there's anything in particular, I'll make sure that doesn't get shared. But the whole idea was to give you all access to everything discussed in all the breakout groups, so you don't miss great ideas. Thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure to work with you this morning. I really appreciate the comments in the chat as well. Do reach out and stay vulnerable. Thank you.